Hello students, and welcome to our next U.S. history lesson. This one is about the very short life and then violent overthrow of the era of Reconstruction. And I call it How the North Won the War, but the South Won the Peace. When the guns fell silent after Appomattox, the country, certainly the North, the victorious North, was eager to believe the sectional struggle and violence and divisions that had led up to the war, and of course characterized the war itself, was finally over. But that, turns out, was not immediately to be. The sectional struggle of the war years temporarily carried over into the post-war era. Now remember, what had led up to the war itself and to dissolution of the Union was when the disagreement between the northern and the southern states about whether slavery could extend and expand into the western territories and into future states of the United States. When that disagreement became so intense, and Lincoln, the Republican, was elected in 1860 on the position of banning slavery's expansion any further into the West and to the American nation's future. The southern states seceded from the Union and broke it apart, and then northern resolve to preserve the Union is, of course, what led directly to the war. This power struggle, a clash of wills over the issue of slavery and race, continued, spilled over into the so-called Reconstruction era. Now the struggle was over how and on what terms was the Union to be restored. How much change would be brought to the post-war South? And for a brief, short decade in the South, there was a combination of factors that led to an attempt to bring more thoroughgoing change. Part of the reason for that was the idealism of the abolitionists and of the war that it turned into, not only the war to preserve the Union, but became the war to end slavery. Slavery had been ended by the Emancipation Proclamation and then Lincoln's push for the 13th Amendment ending slavery everywhere. But the abolitionists in particular wanted more sweeping and deep change brought by the results of the war. They wanted the uplift of the former slaves. They wanted the slaves, or now called freedmen's, released from domination by their former masters. And indeed, the release of the whole South from domination by the slave owners, or the so-called slave power, who had dominated Southern life and government and arguably led them into secession and the war. Over the South, there would be a setup of government and laws in the South to represent the majority of Southerners, not just the slave owners, to represent the African-American freedmen, and the South's always majority of non-slave-holding whites, the small yeoman farmers and the poor whites. Of course, most white Northerners were not abolitionists, nor true firm believers in racial equality. So what else contributed to a push to transform the South and make it truly democratic and racially egalitarian was the white North's post-war anger and continuing enmity towards the South, towards the great enemy of the war. One factor was Lincoln's assassination in 1865 by a Southern sympathizer, and then the South's unseemly haste to organize new state governments and to send delegations back to Congress who were full of high-ranking Confederate generals and office holders. For example, the state of Georgia sent back into the U.S. Senate the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, and the new hastily thrown together Southern state governments passed so-called black codes. These were oppressive new state laws which denied blacks any rights, no civil liberties or rights, and legally discriminated against the freedmen, against blacks, in the new post-war South's governments. The black codes and these white racist governments seem to indicate the Southern states' immediate determination to keep their former slaves in a condition as close to slavery as possible. Well, these combination of events immediately following the war did cause an uproar in the white Northern government and in the Northern public, angered at the Southern actions and at their obvious unrepentant attitude of defiance. So, in 1867, Congress dissolved these new state governments the South had put together and set up new, stronger rules for the restoration of the Southern states back into the Union. The former Confederacy was organized temporarily into 5 military districts, which were temporarily to be administered by the U.S. Army, which had not all been withdrawn after the war but stayed in place to govern and keep peace and order in the immediate post-war South. U.S. courts, actually military courts, would temporarily enforce the laws and protect the rights of all Southerners. These military districts, under federal authority, were to last only so long as it took new state governments of the South to be formed under new rules Congress put forward. New state constitutional conventions had to be pulled together to draw up a new government, and in these constitutional conventions for each state, black participation had to be allowed. If African Americans were barred from participation, then these new governments would not be recognized by Congress, and the Southern states could not fully re-enter the Union. As well as guaranteeing black participation, at these state conventions, ex-Confederate office holders and Confederate officers in their army were banned from participation. Finally, the new state governments organized had to vote to ratify 3 new amendments to the United States Constitution. These were the Civil War era and Reconstruction amendments. As the momentum of war and of racial progress temporarily carried over into peacetime. These amendments included the 13th Amendment. The Southern states, to be restored into the Union, had to agree to the permanent abolition of slavery. The 14th Amendment, which clarified that all males born into the United States were citizens. This was meant most pointedly to include African Americans, and no matter if they had been slaves or whatever their former condition was, that these people are citizens of the United States. And the 14th Amendment said states and states' laws may not discriminate against their citizens. And it will become the job of the U.S. government to enforce all U.S. citizens' rights, including over states if state governments are choosing to deny them their rights. And the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed all citizens, all American citizens, the right to vote. These amendments were in part an effort to transform the South into a truly democratic society. And as this cartoon, a newspaper cartoon of the era, so graphically symbolizes, the U.S. Constitution now enshrined the principle of equal right for all citizens, regardless of race. And here is a white wrist says Columbia, so that's symbolizing the national government and union. handing through the Constitution and civil rights bills over to this dark hand of an African American, full constitutional rights and liberties. What a great day, eh? Well, the southern states held these conventions and drew up new state constitutions, and then, of course, held elections to fill them. And under congressional imposed, congressional dictated Reconstruction, under those rules, for a brief time, about a short decade, new state governments were elected in the South that were interracial and that largely, although not exclusively, elected Republican Party people into office. The Republicans won elections and passed laws. And initially, the new Southern Republican Party put together a winning electoral and political alliance in all of the new Southern states. It was Republican. It was an interracial coalition composed of, not surprisingly, African Americans. The most transformative immediate impact of Reconstruction in the South was the reality and sight of Southern blacks voting and going to the ballot box. This was a radical, transformative event for Southern life. And, not surprisingly, they voted enthusiastically and overwhelmingly for the Republican Party, which post-Civil War Americans, and certainly members of the Republican Party, identified as the party of the Union and the party of Lincoln and of emancipation. African Americans saw the Democratic Party of this period as the party of secession and slavery, and indeed as the continuing party of ultra-white racism and domination of blacks. So there was no more loyal component of the Southern Republican political coalition than African American voters. Of course, African Americans were not actually the majority of voters in any Southern state during Reconstruction. They were a little less than half in every state. So there had to be more to the Republican coalition than just black voters, and there were. A good chunk of the white South in the Reconstruction period voted with blacks for the Republican Party. We don't know the exact number. We think somewhere between a quarter to a third of native-born white Southerners were willing to cast their lots with the new biracial governments and parties of the South. Why did they do this? Well, for a number of reasons. Many of them had, before the war, not been Democrats, but Whigs, who agreed with the Whigs' general philosophy that public policy and government had a positive role to play in encouraging, for example, economic development in the country. So pre-war Southern white Whigs, many of them funneled into the new Republican Party of the post-war period. There was people who favored economic development, like the building of railroads and movement towards industrializing in the South after the war. There was also the idea held by many of these white Southerners that the average white Southerner's interests were not served by planter-dominated government and politics. A classic example is the planter class's traditional opposition to instituting public tax-supported schools in the South. After all, since the planters' workforce was illiterate blacks who to pick cotton didn't need to know how to read and write or be educated, it was arguably not in the self-interest of the elite planter class to want to support public education for poor whites and for blacks. White Southerners who, for a variety of reasons, supported the Republican Party and its interracial alliance were demonized in the Reconstruction era by Democrats, who called Southern Republicans, quote, nigger and Yankee-loving so-called scalawags, some kind of old nag of a horse. White Democrats and Southerners felt that the scalawags, white Southerners, were racial and regional traitors. Traitors to the South, traitor to the white race. Eventually, they will be more than name-called by other white Southerners. They will be tyrannized, and they will be killed and assassinated for their political cooperation with blacks and with Northerners. Finally, another significant, although the smallest part, of the Republican coalition in the South were Northerners who moved south. Most of them, I should say, actually stayed south. There were a considerable number of white Northerners, many of them affiliated with the Army and the administration of the immediate post-war South, who stayed in the South after the war, who decided to adopt it as their new home. Many of these were military administrators and officers of the Union Army, and some of them became Republican office holders after the war. Many of these Northerners who stayed in the South after the war, most of them probably were former abolitionists and were a highly idealistic bunch. They were dedicated to trying to transform the South into a racially egalitarian and a more democratic society for all. Now, their white Southern opponents would demonize them as so-called selfish carpetbaggers. The idea of a carpetbagger was they were selfish and coming from outside to take advantage of the South. Well, in fact, many of these white Northerners who took up lives in the post-war South were, for example, fervently Christian, idealistic Northerners, part of the so-called crusade of the New England schoolmarm. Women and male teachers who flocked to the South to set up new freedom schools for the freedmen after the Civil War. And they were committed to trying to radically transform and reconstruct the South into what they thought was a better society. General Oliver Howard is another good example. He was a former Union soldier and general who took up a new life in the post-war South. As this cover of this book by Gordon Well shows, he was idealistic and dedicated. That was his main motivation. He is, by the way, the founder of a historically black college, Howard University in Washington, D.C. today. However, as I say, Northerners living in the Reconstruction era South were demonized by white racists and Democrats as selfish carpetbaggers. Hated outsiders Yankees who were coming in selfishly to have their own economic and political opportunities. Opportunists looking to feast on a helpless, prostrate post-war South, as this cartoon demonstrates. Now, sure, in everyone's mix of motives, why do you move to a new place, start a new life? There is a sense that there are opportunities there to open for you in life. But the carpetbagger charge implies that Northerners who came to live South were only motivated by venal, selfish gain. It overlooks the intense idealism that was clearly part of so many of them. So the full Republican Party coalition was African Americans, or the freedmen, many native-born Southern whites, and some Northerners who moved south and started new lives there. So during Reconstruction, for a brief time, lasting for sometimes as few as a couple years in a state, but lasting a short decade, 5 to 10 years, this electoral majority voted in Republican office holders who for a few years passed remarkable laws and policies, remarkable, and they were so different from anything the Southern states had ever seen since they'd always been in the slavery era until now. So the kinds of policies that the new governments put in place were, well, they established the South's first public schools for whites as well as, of course, for blacks. They focused on building railroads throughout the South, and they adopted in general pro-industrial policies intent on trying to transform the South and move it in the direction that the northern states were increasingly moving in. Now, there was a lot of destruction and physical plant destroyed during the war, which had, of course, wreaked great havoc on the South. Naturally, necessarily, there were increased state expenditures for reconstruction, literal physical reconstruction to rebuild roads and bridges. Also, of course, raised taxes to institute things like public schools. Also remarkably, for the first time, there were laws passed by the new governments to help debtors and to help renters. Now, this was all unprecedented. And it's not only revolutionary that these governments tried to represent the interests of non-whites, of blacks for the first time. We naturally, understandably fixate on the racial revolution component. But there was a big class difference between economic groups. These new governments arguably served quite different class interests and clashed with the interests of the big planters and their desires and interests, who above all wanted to keep taxation low, keep as much of their wealth for themselves, and who did not want to invest in infrastructure and in public schools. These governments and their policies were detested by the rich planter class and by the most racist of white Southerners. Why then, and for decades later, why were these governments so controversial and often hated? Well, first and foremost, they had their opponents levied the charge that these governments represented black rule, black political and government domination over whites. Now, of course, this was not literally true, since in no state were blacks the absolute majority of voters. To the white conservative mind, these were an example of federal tyranny over states, the national government invading the rights of states and taking away their life and liberty and imposing hated policies upon them. There were then and later charges against these governments of corruption, of bribery, of public funds sometimes being diverted into private pockets. Now, we must admit that there was bribery and corruption that occurred in these states. But as you know from reading about American government and politics in general in the late 1800s and in the so-called Gilded Age, sadly, this was a period of widespread government corruption. And the southern states in Reconstruction were no exception. But neither were they arguably any more corrupt than governments in the North or elsewhere, or in the post-Reconstruction state governments. The sort of catch-all charge by its opponents against these new Republican state governments was that they represented a crazy world in which the worst ruled over the best in society. Blacks, the inferior blacks, supposedly inferior, ruling over the superior whites, supposedly. And the poor and ignorant were dominating politically and in government policy over the rich and wise and wealthy. This infuriated especially the planter class, who felt that they, the best, were being dethroned from government and taxed against their will. These governments were taking the money of the good people and redistributing it through schools and such things, giving that money to the worthless, undeserving people of their society. And, these governments were committing the sin of confiscating and redistributing wealth through government policy. Supposedly, this is the view of the people that so detested these governments. As this political cartoon of the era demonstrates, there became immediately organization against these new governments. This is white supremacy in the Democratic Party, it says. This is the Ku Klux Klan, of course, the most famous of just a number of white terrorist or anti-Reconstruction organizations that existed in this period. Indeed, the KKK was a virtual wing of the Southern Democratic Party in this period. I want to point out to you two slogans here. One is, and you can't read it, I think, it's small print, this is a white man's government, so they're expressing their revulsion against black participation in government and politics. And this one says, the Union as it was, the Union as it was. This is the South as a white man's government and the Union as it was. This is getting back to the idea that the South wished to bring as little change to their lifestyle and their society after the war as possible. The violent hatred and opposition against these new biracial governments meant that anytime there was an opening, anytime the opponents could use force and violence to defy federal authorities and to attack these governments, they would. Unless they were restrained by U.S. Army forces and federal officials, they would never put up with the institution of these new, small d, democratic governments and capital R, Republican Party elected governments. And alas, these governments did not last very long. Southern Democrats launched a campaign of political violence and uprising to try to get rid of these governments. In white racist, anti-Reconstruction lore, the violent political overthrow of the Reconstruction era state governments was called, quote, Southern Redemption. Supported and funded by the wealthy planter class, paramilitary groups such as the so-called White Shirts, Knights of the Black Camellia, and most famously, the Ku Klux Klan, launched campaigns of terror and violence. They were first and foremost concerned to suppress black voting. They organized what they jokingly called rifle clubs, which be happening to be out on election day shooting at targets and maybe, for example, conveniently being on the part of a road between the black part of town and where the polling booth was, to intimidate and scare black voters and make them fear for their lives if indeed they were going to vote on Election Day. They were not only trying to suppress, keep down black voting by any means necessary, they also engaged in not only intimidation but assassination, purposely killing white and black Republican candidates running for office. This was systematic political terror meant to help the white Southern Democrats win and carry the elections. Now, there were two big reasons, I would argue, overall, for the Southern state government's eventual fall. One was the majority of white Southerners' hatred of black participation in politics and of federal support for black rights and federal intervention into their states. The majority of white Southerners waited, bided their time, and would strike whenever given the chance. And secondly, and in hindsight, sadly, it was the gradually declining federal government and Northern will to defend and support both white and black Republican voters in the South. So much of the white South's attitude was hostile to these, that they would be eventually able to drive out these Republican elected governments from power throughout the South. So at this point, we will switch to a song which was popular in the South from the mid-1870s throughout the late 1800s. And again, we will now be magically transported to the singing studio where I will sing for you I'm a Good Old Rebel, an anti-Reconstruction song. And this is the song, I'm a Good Old Rebel. Oh, I'm a good old rebel, that's what I am. And for this land of freedom, I don't give a damn. I'm glad I fought again her, I only wish we'd won. And I ain't asked any pardon for anything I've done. 3,100 Yankees is dead in Southern dust. We got 300,000 before they conquered us. They died of Southern fever, of Southern steel and shot. I wish they was 3 million instead of what we got. I hate the Yankee nation and everything they do. I hate the Declaration of Independence too. I hate the glorious Union, 'tis dripping with our blood. I hate the striped banner, I fought it all I could. I can't take up my musket and fight them no more. But I'm not going to love them, and that is certain sure. And I don't want no pardon for what I was or am. I won't be reconstructed, and I don't give a damn. So that's the song, I'm a Good Old Rebel. Well, now that we're back, we'll do as we always do and examine more closely some of the lyrics of the historical song we just looked at. So, of course, Oh, I'm a Good Old Rebel is a post-Reconstruction and indeed anti-Reconstruction white Southern song. As I think you can tell, you can almost feel the hatred, the hate-filled defiance of many of these lyrics, and a stubborn culture of resistance and defiance against the national government and indeed against the new state governments that had been formed in this period. So for this land of freedom, I don't give a damn. Well, that tells you a lot. And I haven't asked a pardon for anything I've done. I'm just wishing they'd been able to kill more Yankees. Again, you kind of know exactly where they're coming from in this song. I hate the Yankee Nation. I hate the Declaration of Independence too. My goodness, that's pretty strong. Hate the Union, according to the song, hate the U.S. flag and all it stands for, and if given any chance, be happy to overturn it. Indeed will. I won't be reconstructed. I'm not going to be changed from how we'd been before the war, and I don't give a damn, right? So these attitudes of that song are a big part of the answer for why Reconstruction was violently overthrown and ended in the 1870s in what racist white Southerners called Southern redemption, you know, back from death or worse. So Southern Democrats launched their campaign of political terror and violence, which did succeed in gradually driving out Republican office holders from all the Southern state governments and returning all-white Democratic Party rule. And at the same time, federal protection of and enforcement of civil rights in the South and voting rights steadily waned. Yes, white democratic terror gradually drove Republicans out of office and control of government in the South. But that sort of begs the question, why did the U.S. government and Northern public's commitment to intervene in the South in order to promote civil rights and democracy, why did that will and commitment increasingly fade and diminish over time? Early on, coming right out of the war, Southern outrages, violent campaigns, sometimes roused Northerners and their government to crack down on this lawlessness and disorder and violence. But as the decades moved on, there is a gradual tiring, a sort of wearing down of Northern resolve. The public was getting sick of hearing about what was going on in the distant Southern states. And the public is getting tired of nonstop sectional strife and conflict between the North and South. After all, it's been going on for, gosh, if you go back to the 1850s and the run-up to the Civil War, it's been going on for 20 plus years now. Also, as the actual fighting of the war begins to fade away and get removed in memory, the wartime mentality and mentality of enmity towards the South is wearing off among Northerners. And there is a desire for a return to normalcy, to get past of all the issues that the war and now the post-war period seem to be endlessly embroiled in. Issues of states' rights, issues of voting, issues of the place of blacks in American life. You can see signs of this gradually happening. The number of federal troops, instead of being increased in the midst of the violence, were gradually being withdrawn and the numbers going down, making it harder for them to control events and order in the South. You see signs of this. Congress in the early 1870s pardoned all ex-Confederates, allowed them full voting rights and ability to be in government again. As national determination and willingness to intervene in the South flagged. White Southern racists and Democrats there were emboldened and saw their chance and their opening. I would be insincere if I didn't also emphasize that among the reasons for the declining white willingness to be involved in the South was white racism, which was not unique to the Southern states. Racism was always there, infecting the majority of white Northerners as well. And it became resurgent in North and South during the 1870s. Because of abolitionism, because of the extreme issues and momentum of the war, while racism have, of course, never been rooted out, there was some momentum, some progress against it during and then immediately following the Civil War, as symbolized by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the abolition of slavery and temporarily the empowerment and guarantee of constitutional rights to all Americans, including non-whites. By the mid-1870s, there was a flood of southeastern poor European immigrants pouring into the northern states to work in the low-skilled factories, and most native-born white Protestant Northern Americans felt that these were their racial inferiors, these new immigrants. In this conditions, in this atmosphere, there was more sympathy in the North for the white Southerners' predicament of how do you deal with racially inferior workers. And some white Northerners saying the white North with the new immigrants is experiencing a similar phenomenon. In much of the North, there began to be a cry for no more special government help for African Americans in the South. They'd been freed, they'd been given voting rights. The attitude was let them sink or swim on their own now. And they began to be the cry, let the South work out its own race relations. They know how to deal with their supposed biological inferiors better than having the North tell them. And the idea to get past the issues of the war, including restore home rule to the southern states and clear out of that. Now, this was happening gradually, but if there's any one symbolic climatic event of the waning federal enforcement and protection for civil rights and for the gradual slow death of Reconstruction in the South, it came up in a disputed, heated presidential election of the year 1876, which saw the Republican candidate for president, Rutherford B. Hayes, pitted against the Democratic candidate, Samuel Tilden. Now, during this election of 1876, white terrorist so-called redemption in the South was at full tide. Already in a majority of the southern states, Republicans had been driven from power. Republicans still were in place in only 3 deep southern states. Those states were Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. During the presidential election in those 3 states, continuing political violence by Democrats and cheating and voting fraud by Democrats and, well, let's be fair, probably Republicans as well in those states was rampant. The Democratic counters of the ballots for president and the Republicans in those 3 southern states, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, each sent in different and conflicting results to the National Electoral College. The Southern Democrats reporting that Tilden, the Democrat, had won in their states, and the Southern Republicans of those 3 states reporting that Republican Hayes had carried their states. This actually produced quite a political crisis in the country. Congress set up a National Electoral Commission to look into and decide these disputed votes and who had won the election. The committee was composed of an equal number of Republican and Democratic Party members and one political independent. There were 19 disputed electoral votes, the three combined votes of these deep southern states. If only one of the disputed 19 votes was awarded to the Democrat Tilden, that would make him president. For the Republican Hayes to win, the commission would have to award him all 19 of the disputed votes. Well, the supposed political independent on the commission publicly became a Republican, and then by a straight party vote, in other words, all the Republicans voted one way, all the Democrats on the commission voted the other way, by a one-vote majority, all 19 votes were given to the Republican Hayes, making him President of the United States. Well, this extremely controversial, unusual ending to a presidential election sparked outrage by Democrats north and south, and nowhere more so than in the South. Uproar by the Democrats nationally, wild talk and newspaper editorials about, if necessary, Democrats would use arms, force of arms, to block Hayes taking the office of the presidency. And as this newspaper editorial headline says, Tilden or blood was the wild choice being floated by a lot of Democrats. Here's another one. Emotions are running high, another Tilden or blood. And here's a calmer hand, trying to keep the one from picking up a gun. The nation's edge was very much, the nation's nerves, were very much on edge. It was less than 20 years ago. They still had the memory of a recent controversial presidential election in which the election of a Republican, Lincoln back then in 1860, so outraged Southern Democrats that they had seceded from the Union, dissolved the Union, and plunged the nation into bloodshed and war. Out of this heated situation came the so-called Compromise of 1877, which is also seen symbolically as the final closing chapter of national Reconstruction. In return for some key Southern Democrats' support and willingness to publicly say they accepted Hayes' election as president, the new President-elect Hayes promised to withdraw all remaining U.S. troops from the South and to restore so-called Southern home rule. There would be no further U.S. support of African Americans or indeed any non-Democrats' votes in the South. There'd be no enforcement of civil rights, including voting rights. These could no longer be safely exercised in the South. This was a strong signal from the North and from the national government in general that it was retreating from Reconstruction, giving up on it, and handing all of this back over to the South to decide and control for itself. And when I say South, I don't necessarily mean the majority of Southerners, but the white, ultra-racist, and most conservative of Southerners. Nationwide, not just in the South, this Compromise of 1877 was hailed as an act of great statesmanship. The nation sighed a big sigh of relief Here we see North and South being reunited, and here's the stately, wise Rutherford Hayes making it happen. The nation felt great. We're done with endless sectional conflict. Arguments and conflicts over race and slavery can finally be behind us. Indeed, symbolically, the North and South were bearing the hatchet, going to get over their former divisions and reunite. In this positive, rosy national characterization of what had just happened in the Compromise of 1877, almost no one back then called it a betrayal of the cause of democracy and equal constitutional rights for all, or a betrayal of African Americans. It was hailed as a great, wonderful thing to have done. Now, I know we history teachers are supposed to be fair and objective, but I just can't continue to be on this topic. I don't know which makes my blood boil more. White racists overthrowing democratically elected governments through political violence and terror, and laughing and singing about it with impunity, or the fact that for most of American history following Reconstruction, the enemies of Reconstruction won the debate over the meaning and memory of Reconstruction. In the dominant white imagination, North and South, for nearly a century, the so-called tragic legend of Reconstruction held sway. And actually, you can see this in popular culture. If you've ever seen the classic but pretty darn racist Hollywood movie of the 1930s, Gone with the Wind, its brief portrayal of Reconstruction absolutely flows with this tragic legend vision, in which the nation decides it was a sorry, sad episode, in which the South was right and the North was wrong. Indeed, the North wronged the South by imposing on them a pro-black and federal government tyranny over the southern states. And that version of Reconstruction held strong and firm to the white national imagination until what is often called the Second Reconstruction, by which I mean the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. There has been, from about the mid-1960s to the present, a dramatic change and reversal of the majority opinion, and especially among historians, of what Reconstruction was. And it's now increasingly seen as an important step towards creating true democracy in racial equality in America that was wrong and shamefully abandoned by the nation back then. This immediate post-war movement towards true racial and democratic freedom was sacrificed on the altar of white racism and states' rights. Nearly 100 years later, it would take a mass democratic movement called the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s to finally bring forward and make permanent what Reconstruction had so nobly but unsuccessfully instituted in the decade following the Civil War. The Civil Rights Movement saw again massive social upheaval and the innocent deaths of many people fighting for racial and generally democratic freedom, trying to overthrow the white Southern racist order. So in my view, and thankfully in that of most Americans today, the tragedy of Reconstruction is not what the old anti-Reconstruction legend says. It's not that such things were ever tried and begun. No, the real tragedy of the rise and fall of national Reconstruction was that we as a nation did not stick with transforming the South and through it the entire nation into a true democracy with justice and freedom for all. And it's a tragedy, it's a shame that when we first started it, we didn't finish the job then, after the Civil War. That's what was and remains tragic about Reconstruction. So in closing, I'll wish you, as always, a good day and good history, as though, as we see in the topic of today's lesson, it has not always been that good of history.